Naomi Owens stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her uniform with a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. As the newly appointed head of internal affairs, she had worked hard to reach this point. Yet, the weight of the responsibility was not lost on her. The department she now commanded was steeped in a legacy of corruption and distrust, and she would have to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining law and order while dismantling the biases ingrained within. Her skin, dark and radiant, seemed to remind her of the challenges she had overcome to get here: discrimination from her peers, the constant need to prove herself in a male-dominated, predominantly white institution. But she had risen above it all. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. A message popped up. "The case is yours." She knew exactly what it meant: an officer under investigation. Not just any officer, but someone who had left a mark on her past, someone she once respected. Officer Grant. Grant. The name stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. They had been childhood friends, sharing experiences, dreams, and even some unspoken promises. But as the years went by, they had drifted apart. The officer she once knew, however, was not the man she had thought he would become. His reputation for using his position to exploit minorities had become well known. And now, Naomi was in charge of investigating him. She exhaled sharply, staring at the reflection in front of her. She had to put aside their history, their shared past. This was not a matter of personal feelings, it was a matter of justice. Yet, the thought of facing him, of confronting the man she once admired, stirred something deeper within her. The investigation was her first major test. Naomi had been handpicked for this position not just because of her qualifications but because she was seen as the one who could break down the barriers within the department. A black woman leading internal affairs was a statement in itself. It was a message to the department, to the city, and to the community at large. But Naomi was not interested in being a symbol. She was here to make real change. She had never been one to shy away from difficult situations, but this was different. This was personal. As she walked into the Office of Internal Affairs, the atmosphere felt different. Colleagues looked at her with respect, but there was also an underlying tension. She had earned her place, but now she had to prove she belonged, not just to her superiors but to herself. The department was divided. Some wanted change, but many were entrenched in the status quo. Naomi would have to lead them through a transformation they were not prepared for. She began her day with the basics, reviewing the case file. Officer Grant had been accused of multiple counts of racial discrimination, harassment, and excessive use of force, specifically targeting Black and Latino individuals in the city. These were not just allegations, the evidence was damning. Naomi stared at the photographs of the victims, each one a story of injustice, and each one a reminder of the systems that allowed such behavior to continue. The city was plagued by distrust in law enforcement, especially among its minority communities. Naomi was expected to fix this, to repair the relationship between the department and the people it was meant to serve. But could she hold Officer Grant accountable without tearing apart everything she had worked so hard to build? The question lingered in her mind as she reviewed the case further. Naomi had always believed in accountability, no matter who the person was or how high their rank. The idea of turning a blind eye, of protecting someone based on loyalty or friendship, went against everything she stood for. But how could she reconcile this with the man she once knew? The man who had been there for her during tough times, who had stood by her side when others turned away. Grant had always been the charismatic, confident officer, loved by his peers, feared by those who came into contact with him. But somewhere along the way, he had become a symbol of the very injustice Naomi had fought against her entire life. He had allowed his position to corrupt him. But was he truly beyond redemption? Could someone like him change, or was he irredeemable? Naomi shook her head, trying to refocus. She had no room for sentimental thinking. This was not about their past, this was about the future. The future of the department, the future of the city, and the future of the communities who depended on them. She had to remain objective. The evidence was clear, and the investigation needed to move forward. There was no room for bias, No room for hesitation. Her thoughts were interrupted when her assistant, Kevin, entered the room. "Ma'am, you have a meeting with the mayor in 30 minutes. He wants an update on the Grant case." Naomi nodded, dismissing him with a wave. She didn't need to be reminded of the political pressures she was facing. The mayor was eager for quick results, but Naomi knew that real change took time. The public wanted justice, but they also wanted things to move swiftly. That was something Naomi would have to manage carefully. Her every move would be scrutinized, her every decision questioned. She left the office and walked to the mayor's office, her thoughts still consumed by the investigation. As she entered, she was met with the usual political pleasantries. The mayor, a tall man in his late 40s, greeted her with a handshake. "Detective Owens, thank you for coming on such short notice. How's the Grant case going?" Naomi took a seat across from him, trying to keep her composure. "It's progressing. We're gathering evidence, and interviews are ongoing. There's a lot to unpack, but we're getting closer." The mayor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I hope you're not letting personal feelings cloud your judgment. The department needs to see that you're objective. We need to clean house, and we need to do it fast." Naomi didn't flinch at his words. "I'm fully aware of the gravity of this situation, Mr. Mayor. But this isn't just about removing one officer. It's about creating a system that holds everyone accountable, no matter their rank." The mayor looked skeptical, but he nodded in agreement. "Just be careful. We don't want to create a crisis out of this. Grant has a lot of support. He's been with the force for years. The last thing we need is a public scandal." Naomi stood up, her resolve strengthening. "The last thing we need is to let something like this continue. If we don't hold people accountable, we risk losing the trust of the people we're meant to protect." With that, she left the meeting, her mind even more focused than before. The path ahead would not be easy, but Naomi was ready. She had the strength, the courage, and the conviction to see this through. It was time to confront Officer Grant, to face the man who had once been a friend, and to expose the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The investigation was only just beginning, and Naomi knew the road ahead would test everything she believed in. But she was determined to fight for justice, determined to hold people accountable, and determined to bring about the change that was so desperately needed. And she would not back down. Naomi sat at her desk, the case file laid open in front of her. The weight of the evidence against Officer Grant was undeniable, but that didn't make her task any easier. She had to navigate the fine line between professionalism and personal history. Grant had once been her close friend. They had shared dreams and ideals, two young people caught in a system that was supposed to protect and serve but often failed those who needed it the most. Naomi's mind flashed back to their shared childhood, a time when they had been inseparable. But those memories felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. As she skimmed through the documents, Naomi's fingers trembled slightly, a response to the mounting pressure. The reports of racial profiling, the accounts of excessive force, the testimonies from citizens who had been mistreated, each piece of evidence painted a portrait of a man who had let power corrupt him. This wasn't just about misconduct. It was about a systemic issue, a rot that had festered for too long within the department. But Grant was still just a man, someone she had known, someone she had once trusted. Could she really move forward with this investigation? Could she truly expose him without succumbing to the emotions that threatened to cloud her judgment? Naomi shook her head, forcing herself to focus. She was no longer that young woman from her past, no longer the person who had been blinded by love and loyalty. She was the head of internal affairs now, and her job was to seek the truth, no matter where it led. She needed to be strong, for herself and for those who would be affected by this investigation. The department had a culture of silence, a reluctance to confront the dark side of law enforcement. She had been brought in to change that, but change didn't come without sacrifice. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Kevin, her assistant. "Ma'am, you need to see this," he said, urgency in his voice. Naomi felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What is it?" "There's a video," Kevin replied. of Grant in a confrontation with a black man on the street. It's bad, Naomi. She immediately stood up, heart pounding. Send it to me. As she watched the video, Naomi's blood ran cold. The footage was raw, a snapshot of the officer she had once known, a man who had lost his way. The video showed Grant aggressively confronting a black man who had allegedly been jaywalking. It was clear that the man was not resisting, yet Grant's behavior was out of line. He shoved the man to the ground, shouting racial slurs and using excessive force. Naomi had seen countless videos of police brutality, but this one hit differently. This was someone she knew. This was someone she had once called a friend. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders like a heavy burden. Naomi knew this was the turning point. This was the evidence she needed to expose Grant. But there was something else, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispering that maybe this wasn't the whole story, that maybe there was more to Grant's actions than what appeared on the surface. Could he have been pushed to this point? Was there something in his past, something that Naomi didn't know, that had shaped him into the officer he had become? Naomi closed her eyes, trying to shut out the questions that swirled in her mind. She had to remain focused. This wasn't about redemption for Grant, it was about justice. The truth had to come to light, no matter how difficult it might be. But the road ahead was unclear. Naomi knew that exposing Grant would send shockwaves through the department. He was a decorated officer, respected by many of his peers. There would be those who would try to protect him, who would claim that this was all a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. But Naomi couldn't afford to let that happen. She couldn't afford to let him get away with it. She knew that the path she was about to take would not be easy. There would be resistance, not just from Grant, but from the very system that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. Naomi would have to fight not only for justice but for the integrity of the department itself. And that fight would be relentless. As she continued to review the evidence, Naomi felt a surge of determination. She was ready. This investigation was no longer just about Officer Grant, it was about the future of law enforcement, about creating a department that was accountable to the people it was meant to serve. She was the one who could make this change, who could tear down the walls of corruption and rebuild something better. But it wouldn't be easy, and it would require every ounce of strength she had. Naomi made the decision to move forward. She would confront Grant. She would give him the opportunity to explain himself, but she would not back down. If he was guilty, she would hold him accountable. There could be no other option. As she prepared to face him, Naomi knew this moment would define her career, but it would also define the future of the department. She had been given the chance to make a difference, and she wouldn't waste it. The investigation was underway, and Naomi had made her choice. She would expose the truth, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. This was her responsibility, and she would see it through. The battle for justice had begun, and Naomi was ready to fight. Naomi sat at her desk, staring at the file in front of her. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet, it didn't feel like enough. She needed more. The video had brought everything into sharp focus, but there were still gaps in the story. She had to get inside Grant's head, understand why he had become the man he was now. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Kevin. "I've got a lead. Someone wants to talk." Naomi's heart quickened. Who could possibly want to speak out now? The department was notorious for its silence. Those who spoke up were quickly shut down, sometimes permanently. She quickly responded. "Set it up. Now." The next few hours were a blur. Naomi's mind kept circling back to Grant, his past, their shared history, the person he had been before everything changed. What had turned him into the man who terrorized the community, someone who abused his position to perpetuate racial violence? Was this the person she had once known? Or had that person always been buried beneath the surface? She arrived at the meeting with the informant, a nervous young officer who had recently been transferred into the department. He looked around before speaking, his voice low and filled with caution. "I've been with Grant for a while now. He's always had issues. But it's gotten worse. Much worse. I've seen him target people for no reason at all. I don't know if anyone else will listen, but I can't stay silent anymore. Naomi listened intently. The officer's words confirmed much of what she had suspected. Grant wasn't just a bad apple in an otherwise good system, he was a symptom of a much larger problem. There was a culture within the department, one that allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. Naomi had seen it before, but now it felt more urgent, more real. The time for change was long overdue. As the officer finished speaking, Naomi nodded. She couldn't thank him enough for stepping forward, but she couldn't let him see her soft side either. You've done the right thing. Don't worry about what happens next. I'll handle it. She stood up, the weight of the conversation settling in her chest. This was bigger than she had thought. The system was broken, and Grant wasn't the only one responsible. But she would bring him down first. When she returned to the office, Naomi knew that she had to act fast. Every minute that passed allowed Grant to cover his tracks, to destroy evidence, to intimidate others. She couldn't let him win. Not this time. The next step was to confront Grant directly. She had to give him a chance to explain himself, to see if there was any ounce of remorse left in him. She wasn't sure why, but she felt that it was the right thing to do. She had seen how powerful denial could be, how people who had done wrong could still convince themselves they were justified. Naomi had to break through that wall, make him see the reality of what he had done. When she stood face to face with him, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Naomi had expected this. He knew her, and despite everything that had happened, he could still see her as the person from his past. But she wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't the naive woman who had admired him. Grant, she said, her voice steady but firm. You've been accused of something serious. There's evidence against you. This isn't a game. This is your chance to speak, to explain yourself. Why did you do it? Grant's expression hardened. He looked at her, as if she had betrayed him. You don't know what you're talking about. He spat. You're just doing what they want. You think you're better than me, but you're not. You're just like the rest of them. Naomi's patience wore thin, but she didn't let it show. You've hurt people, Grant. You've taken lives. You've used your badge to intimidate, to destroy, to control. And for what? Power? Revenge? What is it? I need to understand. Grant's face twisted with a mix of anger and something Naomi couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Regret? You don't get it. I've been through things you wouldn't understand. People like you don't understand what it's like. You've always had everything handed to you. I had to fight for every damn thing I've got. Naomi's eyes narrowed. That's not an excuse. Everyone faces hardship, Grant. We all have our battles. But that doesn't give you the right to hurt others. You chose this. You chose to become the very thing you once swore to protect people from. The silence that followed was heavy. Naomi could see the cracks beginning to form in Grant's facade. He had been deflecting, trying to paint himself as the victim, but he was losing control. Naomi pressed on, not giving him an inch. Do you even remember what it was like to care? To do the right thing? Naomi asked. I used to believe in you. You were the one who made me think that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But now, you're just another part of the problem. Grant's eyes flickered with something akin to shame, but he quickly masked it. You don't know what it's like, he repeated. You think you've got it all figured out, but you don't. You're just as much a part of the system as I am. Naomi's voice softened, but it was no less firm. I'm not part of the system that lets people like you get away with it. That's why I'm here. To make sure people like you are held accountable. It's over, Grant. You've had your chance, and now you're going to face the consequences. As Naomi left the room, she could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Grant anymore. This was about something much bigger, the fight against a system that protected the wrong people, that allowed racism and corruption to fester unchecked. Naomi knew that this was just the beginning. Exposing Grant was only the first step. There would be more battles, more fights ahead. But she was ready. She had to be. Naomi sat back in her office, feeling the adrenaline fade, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. There was still so much to be done. Grant's actions were just one example. But Naomi knew that if she could take him down, if she could hold him accountable, then maybe, just maybe, she could start to break down the walls that had held her back for so long. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Naomi sat in her office, staring at the case file. The evidence against Grant was undeniable, and yet, the weight of the decision before her felt heavier than she had anticipated. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, the reality was different. She had confronted Grant, given him the opportunity to explain himself, and he had denied any wrongdoing. But there was more. There was a whole system to consider, one that had allowed officers like Grant to thrive. The corruption was deep, rooted in the very structure of the department. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the entire institution. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, marking the passing of time as Naomi prepared for what was next. She had given Grant a chance to face the truth, and now it was time to act. There would be no more waiting, no more second-guessing. The city needed to see that internal affairs was serious, that she was serious. The truth needed to come out, and there was no turning back. Naomi stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked across the room to the window and looked out at the city below. The streets were quiet, but the tension was palpable. She could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. The storm that was about to hit wasn't just about Grant. It was about the reckoning that the entire department had been avoiding for years. Her phone rang, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Kevin again. "Ma'am, we've got a problem," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Grant's lawyer is pushing back. They're threatening to go public with their own evidence. They're claiming that this is all political, a witch hunt." Naomi clenched her jaw. She had expected this. Grant had powerful allies, and they would do whatever it took to protect him. But Naomi couldn't afford to let fear dictate her actions. She had to stay the course. "I'll handle it. We're going forward. Nothing changes." Kevin's voice softened. "I'll make the arrangements for the press conference." Naomi hung up the phone and exhaled slowly. The next step was clear. She would take this to the public. It was the only way to ensure accountability. The department had to know that no one was above the law, not even the most powerful officer. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was more than just about Grant. It was about something bigger, a systemic change that had to happen, not just within the department, but in the way law enforcement interacted with the communities they served. She spent the next few hours preparing her statement, going over the details of the investigation one last time. She knew the stakes. If she failed, if she let this moment slip through her fingers, it would be a crushing blow not just to her career, but to the very cause she had been fighting for. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far to turn back now. When the time came, Naomi walked to the podium, her steps steady, her heart pounding. The press conference was being broadcast live, and Naomi could feel the eyes of the city on her. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her. She took a deep breath and began speaking. "Today, I stand before you as the head of Internal Affairs, tasked with ensuring accountability within our department. I'm here to tell you that the time for change has come. The investigation into Officer Grant has been thorough, and the evidence is clear. Grant has violated the trust of the people he swore to protect. His actions, racist, violent, and unlawful, are a direct reflection of the systemic issues that have been allowed to fester within this department for far too long." The room was silent as Naomi's words echoed through the space. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what she was saying. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a culture of impunity that had protected bad actors for far too long. Naomi wasn't just fighting for justice in this one case, she was fighting for the future of law enforcement itself. "Officer Grant is not the only one responsible," Naomi continued, her voice strong and unwavering. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern of behavior that has been ignored for years. But we will no longer allow this to continue. We will hold every individual accountable, no matter their rank, no matter their position." A murmur rippled through the room, and Naomi could see the reporters jotting down notes, the wheels turning in their heads. This wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge to the entire system. Naomi was calling for a reckoning, and she wasn't backing down. "I understand that this may be uncomfortable," Naomi said, her tone softening slightly. "I understand that this will not be easy. But we cannot allow fear to stop us from doing what is right. We owe it to the communities we serve to create a department that is transparent, that is just, and that is held to the highest standards of accountability." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "We are taking action. We are launching a full review of department practices, and we are committing to comprehensive reform. This is only the beginning. We will not stop until every officer is held to the highest standard of accountability. The people of this city deserve nothing less." With that, Naomi stepped away from the podium, her chest tight with emotion. She had just made her stand. The room erupted into a flurry of questions, but Naomi didn't answer them. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The world would now have to watch as the investigation unfolded. Grant's future was uncertain, but Naomi's commitment to justice was unwavering. Back in her office, Naomi sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She had taken the first step toward the change she had always dreamed of, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, Grant's allies would push back, and there would be those who would try to discredit her. But Naomi was ready. She had prepared for this moment her entire career, and now she had to see it through. She looked out the window once more, the city stretching out before her. It was a city of contrasts, opportunity and inequality, justice and corruption. But Naomi knew that it was possible to change things. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it could happen. She would make sure of it. The fight was far from over, but Naomi was no longer afraid. She had taken a stand, and she was ready for whatever came next. Naomi stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. The weight of the last few days hung heavy on her shoulders. She had taken a stand, made her statement to the world, but the aftermath was beginning to unfold in ways she hadn't expected. The press conference had been a success in one sense. It sent a clear message that change was coming, but it had also ignited a firestorm. Allies were quick to offer their support, but there was also a growing tide of resistance. The department's old guard, those who had protected the status quo for so long, were pushing back in every way they could. It wasn't just about Grant anymore. It was about an entire culture that was suddenly being exposed for the rot it had allowed to grow unchecked. Naomi knew this battle would not be won overnight. The task ahead was daunting, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. She couldn't let herself be distracted by the noise. The truth was out there now. The evidence was undeniable. Grant would face justice, but this was also her opportunity to reshape the future of law enforcement, to ensure that no officer could ever again hide behind the shield of privilege and power. Her phone buzzed, cutting through her thoughts. It was Kevin again. "Ma'am, we've got movement on Grant's case. His lawyer wants to settle. They're offering a plea deal." Naomi's stomach tightened. She had expected this, but it still hit her hard. A plea deal would be a shortcut, a way to avoid a public trial, to keep the case from becoming the spectacle it deserved to be. It would be easy to take the deal, to resolve things quickly and move on. But Naomi wasn't interested in taking the easy road. Not this time. "I'm not taking the deal," Naomi said firmly, her voice steady. "This goes to trial. We need to make an example of him." Kevin hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure? A plea deal could save the department a lot of trouble." Naomi's voice was cold, resolute. "We're not here to protect the department, Kevin. We're here to protect the people. We're here to show that we're willing to fight for justice, no matter what it costs." She hung up, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. The department was already under pressure. The city was divided. Some saw Naomi as a hero, a champion of accountability, while others saw her as a threat to the established order. But Naomi couldn't be swayed by the opinions of those who were afraid of change. She had to do what was right. And what was right was making sure that Grant faced the full consequences of his actions, not some watered-down settlement that would allow him to slip away without answering for what he had done. The following days were filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and tense discussions. The resistance from within the department grew louder, and Naomi could feel the weight of it. There were officers who openly questioned her leadership, who suggested that she was letting personal feelings cloud her judgment. The pressure was mounting, but Naomi stood firm. This wasn't just about Grant, it was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no officer, no matter their rank or position, would ever again be allowed to use their badge as a weapon of oppression. But as the investigation progressed, Naomi began to see something unexpected. Some officers, the younger ones, began to rally behind her. They were eager for change, for reform. They saw Naomi as a beacon of hope, a symbol of what the department could be if it was willing to confront its own demons. Naomi didn't know whether this support would last, but it was a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark situation. It reminded her that even in the face of resistance, there was always room for growth, for change. The case against Grant continued to build, and Naomi knew the moment of truth was coming. She had gathered witness testimony, collected more damning evidence, and secured support from key members of the community. The case would go to trial, and Naomi would ensure that every detail was brought to light. But as the trial approached, the personal cost of this fight began to sink in. The weight of the responsibility, the toll it had taken on her relationships, her career, it was all beginning to feel like too much. She had been so focused on doing the right thing, on bringing Grant to justice, that she hadn't stopped to think about what this had cost her personally. The emotional strain was immense. The people she had once trusted, the friends and colleagues who had supported her, were now turning away, questioning her motives. But there was no going back. Naomi had made her choice, and she would see it through. She had faced down her own doubts and fears to get here, and she couldn't allow herself to falter now. She had to keep her eye on the prize, justice, accountability, and the hope that this could spark a real change within the department. The day of the trial arrived, and Naomi took her place at the head of the courtroom. The tension was palpable, the room filled with reporters, lawyers, and city officials. This was it, the moment of reckoning. As the trial unfolded, Naomi watched as Grant's defense attorney tried to discredit the evidence, to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been pushed to the edge by the pressures of his job. But Naomi knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let anyone twist it. The people who had suffered at Grant's hands weren't just statistics. They were human beings, and Naomi was there to make sure their voices were heard. When the verdict finally came down, Naomi stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. Grant was convicted, sentenced to the full extent of the law. It was a victory, but it wasn't just about Grant. It was about the message that had been sent, that justice would not be denied, that no one was above the law. As Naomi walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled on her. She had done what she had set out to do. But this was only one victory in a much larger battle. The department had been shaken, but the work was far from over. Naomi was determined to continue the fight. She had started a movement, and there was no turning back now. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. The system would change. And she would be the one to lead it. The weight of the verdict had settled on Naomi's shoulders, but the battle was far from over. Grant was convicted, but the real work was just beginning. The conviction wasn't just a victory for her, it was a message to everyone in the department that change was possible. That justice could be served, even in the face of resistance. But the question lingered, would this be enough? Would this conviction be the turning point for the department, or would it be another moment in history, buried and forgotten as soon as the next scandal emerged? Naomi sat at her desk, reviewing the aftermath of the trial. The media had covered the case extensively, and the public outcry was strong. Some celebrated the conviction, viewing it as a victory for accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Others, particularly those within the department who had long turned a blind eye to the issues of corruption, saw it as an attack. Naomi knew she had stirred something deep within the institution, something that had been festering for years. The old guard didn't take kindly to change, and Naomi was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to protect their power. But there was no time to dwell on the resistance. Naomi had made a commitment, not just to the people, but to herself. She would be the one to reshape the culture within the department, to challenge the systems that had allowed officers like Grant to thrive. She had never been afraid of confrontation, but this wasn't going to be a simple fight. This was a long-term commitment to root out the corruption that ran deep within the force. If Naomi wanted to ensure that Grant's conviction wasn't an isolated incident, she would have to change the culture of the department from within. She knew that the people in charge, those who had allowed officers like Grant to abuse their power for years, were not going to simply fade into the background. They were already making their moves. Naomi had to stay 2 steps ahead, anticipating their next move. She could feel the pressure mounting with every passing day. The whispers in the hallways, the side glances from colleagues who had once supported her. It was all becoming too much. The path she had chosen was a lonely one, but it was the only path that made sense. Naomi spent the following weeks organizing a series of meetings with the department's senior leadership. She had to make them see that this wasn't just about Grant. This was about the culture of silence that had protected officers like him for too long. The department needed to do more than simply root out the bad apples. They needed to change the way they operated entirely. Naomi had a plan, but it wasn't going to be easy to sell. Change of this magnitude was never welcomed by those who benefited from the status quo. But Naomi wasn't interested in making things comfortable for anyone. This had to be done. The meetings were tense. The resistance was palpable. Some of the senior officers were willing to admit that things needed to change, but only in the most superficial of ways. They were willing to tweak policies, implement a few new training programs, but they weren't willing to confront the deeper issues at play. Naomi knew that these small changes wouldn't be enough. They would placate the public for a while, but they wouldn't address the systemic issues that had allowed Grant to operate unchecked for so long. She pushed harder. "This isn't about appeasing the public," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This is about creating a department where every officer is held to the same standard of accountability, where there is no room for corruption, no room for discrimination. We cannot afford to treat this like a PR problem. We have a moral obligation to the communities we serve to do better." Some of the senior officers looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly resistant to the idea of real change. But Naomi didn't back down. She outlined a comprehensive plan for reform, one that included independent oversight, mandatory diversity and inclusion training, and a complete overhaul of the department's internal disciplinary procedures. She knew it would be difficult, but it was the only way forward. The discussions continued for weeks. Naomi was relentless, pushing for policies that would ensure real accountability. But as she fought to bring the department into the 21st century, she began to notice cracks in her own support system. Some of the younger officers who had once rallied behind her started to fade into the background. They were scared. They had seen what happened to those who stood against the system. The pressure was starting to take its toll. Naomi was well aware of the risks. She had seen it happen to others in her position, those who had tried to bring about change, only to be crushed by the weight of the institution. But she wasn't willing to give up. She knew the fight for reform was never easy. She had already sacrificed so much: her reputation, her relationships, her peace of mind. But it wasn't about her anymore. It was about the future of the department, the future of law enforcement. She had started something, and she would see it through. One evening, after another exhausting day of meetings and pushback, Naomi sat alone in her office. The city lights outside blurred into a haze as she leaned back in her chair, trying to gather her thoughts. She knew she couldn't do this alone. The department was fractured, and the resistance was strong. But she had seen glimpses of change, glimpses of officers who were ready to step up, who were ready to make a difference. Naomi wasn't ready to give up on them. The next morning, she called a meeting with her team. She needed to remind them why they were here, why they had chosen to become part of this movement for change. "We're not done," she said, looking around the room at the officers who had stood with her through this long journey. "Grant's conviction was just the beginning. The real work is happening now. We have a chance to make something better, to leave a legacy that lasts. We can't let the old guard take us down. We're stronger than that. We are the future of law enforcement." As she spoke, Naomi could feel the weight of the responsibility lift slightly. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who believed in the same vision, who were willing to fight for the future of the department. And together they would push through the resistance, break down the walls that had been built to protect corruption, and create something better. The road ahead was long. There would be more battles, more struggles, more setbacks. But Naomi was prepared. She had already faced her toughest challenge, facing down Grant, exposing the truth, and bringing him to justice. Now, she would fight for a future where justice wasn't a rare exception but the standard. It was a fight worth having, and Naomi wasn't going to stop until she had won it. Naomi's office was quieter than usual, the absence of voices a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined the last several months. She sat behind her desk, looking out the window at the city below, the weight of her journey settling into her bones. The department had changed, but not in the way she had hoped. The public support for reform had been strong at first, but it was already beginning to wane. The old guard had dug in its heels, resisting every move she made. Every attempt at true change had been met with more opposition, more sabotage, and more efforts to maintain the status quo. It wasn't just Grant who had resisted, it was the system itself. Despite the setbacks, Naomi refused to back down. She had made a promise to the communities who had suffered under the corrupt practices of officers like Grant. She had promised that she would reform the system. But now, as she sat at her desk, she realized that reform wasn't just about policies or internal reviews. It wasn't just about the cases she had won or the officers she had held accountable. It was about something deeper, a shift in the very fabric of the department, one that could take years, if not decades, to fully realize. Naomi's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Kevin again. "Ma'am, I think we've got something. A new angle on the corruption issue. A source is willing to talk." Naomi sat up straight, her interest piqued. She had heard similar promises before, only to have them fizzle out. But this time, something felt different. She had to act quickly. Without hesitation, she grabbed her jacket and left her office, heading to meet Kevin. As they walked into a quiet room, Naomi could see the fear in the young officer's eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Naomi asked gently. "This could cost you everything." The officer, barely in his 20s, nodded. "I don't want to be part of this anymore. I can't stand by and watch what's happening. I've seen things I can't ignore." Naomi listened intently as the officer revealed details of an underground network of officers who were profiting off criminal activities, drugs, protection rackets, and even extortion. It was clear that this wasn't just one or two bad apples. This was a full-blown criminal operation hidden within the department. Naomi had known that corruption ran deep, but hearing it firsthand, from someone within the ranks, made her stomach turn. This wasn't just about bad policing. This was organized crime. The officer handed her a stack of documents, evidence that corroborated the story. Naomi's heart raced as she looked through the pages. This was the breakthrough she needed. It wasn't just about taking down Grant anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed officers to operate with impunity. The stakes were higher than ever before. But Naomi knew that this was a double-edged sword. The department would do anything to protect its own. Exposing this level of corruption could bring the entire system down, and Naomi was ready to take that risk. She had already lost so much in this fight: friends, allies, and even her own sense of peace. There was no turning back now. The system had to be exposed, no matter the cost. Naomi spent the next few days putting together a plan. The timing was critical. She couldn't let anyone get wind of the investigation before she was ready. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with trusted officers, preparing her team for the inevitable backlash. The resistance she faced would be unlike anything she had encountered before. This wasn't just about defending one man anymore. This was about protecting an entire network of corruption that ran deep within the department. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Naomi's colleagues were growing increasingly hostile. Some accused her of tearing the department apart, of betraying the very institution she had dedicated her life to. They called her a troublemaker, a threat to their livelihood. But Naomi didn't care anymore. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it, no matter the consequences. She had seen firsthand what the system was capable of, and she knew it would only get worse if no one took a stand. The day finally came. Naomi called a meeting with the mayor, the media, and key figures from the department. She would expose everything: the corruption, the criminal activities, the officers who had been abusing their power for years. It was time for the truth to come out. She walked into the room, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settle heavily on her shoulders. This was the moment that would define everything she had worked for. The room fell silent as Naomi began speaking. "What I'm about to share with you will change everything. The department, as you know it, is corrupt. We have officers who have been using their positions of power to engage in criminal activities, drug trafficking, extortion, and violence. This isn't a case of a few bad apples. This is a network of officers working together to exploit the very people they swore to protect." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled to get the story, while department officials scrambled to contain the damage. Naomi's words were met with shock and disbelief, but she continued, unflinching. "I have the evidence to prove it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling around her. "These officers are no longer above the law. They will be held accountable for their actions, and we will rebuild this department from the ground up." The backlash was immediate and fierce. Her phone rang nonstop with calls from department brass, from allies who were now backing away, from those who were desperate to stop her from going further. The mayor's office was pressuring her to reconsider, urging her to think about the political ramifications of what she had just done. But Naomi wasn't backing down. She had exposed the truth, and now it was time for the world to see it. As the media frenzy grew, Naomi knew the true test was just beginning. She had taken down one of the most powerful criminal networks within the department, but the road ahead would be even harder. The department would fight back, the city would divide, and Naomi would be forced to confront the powerful forces trying to tear down everything she had built. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her responsibility lighten. She had done what she set out to do. She had taken the first step toward creating a department that was truly accountable, and she wasn't going to stop until the system was fixed. The fight wasn't over, but Naomi was ready for whatever came next. She had begun a revolution, and there was no turning back now.